Everyone called me a hero. The local paper printed that exact word. Hero waitress stops billionaire poisoning. And my manager framed the clipping and hung it by the hostess stand. And for about 2 weeks, strangers bought my coffee and shook my hand. 2 words I'd whispered across a white tablecloth had turned me, overnight, into the bravest woman in the city. People I'd never met smiled at me on the street. I have spent every day since wishing I could take those 2 words back. Because here is the thing none of the people clapping for me understood, the thing I didn't understand myself until it was nearly too late. I did not save an innocent man that night. I looked at a husband and a wife across a candlelit table, and I decided in half a second who the monster was, and I was wrong. I handed a drowning woman back to the thing she was drowning in, and the story everybody wanted to tell, brave waitress, wicked wife, rescued billionaire, was a lie built out of how little any of us could see from across the room. Let me tell you what really happened, and what I did to try to make it right, and what it taught me about how dangerous it is to be certain. I waited tables at the Halcyon, a private dining room on the top floor of a hotel downtown, the kind of place where a single dinner cost what I made in a week, and the guests never once looked at the people refilling their water. I was 28, working doubles, decent at the job, invisible at it, which in that world is the same as being good. Most nights blurred together, the same wine, the same money, the same careful laughter. I'd come to that job the way a lot of us come to those jobs, which is sideways, after other plans fell through. I'd wanted things once, ordinary things, school, and a different kind of life. And money and bad luck had closed those doors one at a time, until waiting tables at a place where I'd never be able to afford a single plate was just where I'd landed, and I'd made my peace with it. There's a particular education in serving the very rich when you are not. You learn what money does to people, the good and the rotten of it, up close, while being treated as part of the furniture. I'd seen kindness at those tables, and I'd seen cruelty, and I'd gotten proud, over the years, of how quickly I could tell which was which. I thought being invisible had made me a good reader of people. That pride is exactly the thing this story took out of me, and I've decided I'm glad it did. I'd learned to move through those rooms like weather, present and unnoticed, which is exactly why I saw what I saw. Nobody performs for the help. People let their real faces show in front of a waitress the way they'd never show them in front of a peer, because to them, you aren't quite a person in the room. I have seen more truth-carrying water pitchers than most people see in a lifetime. That's what makes what I got wrong that night so hard to forgive. The man at table 4 was Roman Keller, and if you don't know the name where you live, you'd have known it where I do. Tech money first, then real estate, then the kind of money that stops having a source and just becomes weather of its own. But more than the money, Roman Keller was beloved. He gave hospitals their children's wings. He funded scholarships. He stood at podiums with that easy silver smile and talked about giving back. And the city loved him, the way cities love a rich man who remembers to perform humility. When he walked into the Halcyon, the room rearranged itself around him. Even I felt it, the gravity of the man, the warmth that came off him like heat off a stone that has been sitting all day in the sun. His wife was named Elise, and that night was the first time I'd ever served them. And I'll be honest about my first impression because it matters. I didn't like her. She was beautiful in an expensive, brittle way, and she was quiet to the point of being strange, and she barely touched her food, and she kept her eyes down, and when Roman told a story to the table, they were dining with another couple, business friends. She laughed exactly when she was supposed to, and never a beat before. I read all of that, in my quick, certain way, as cold, as a trophy wife who'd gotten what she wanted and found it boring. I looked at the warm, beloved, generous man and his chilly, silent wife, and I sorted them, the way we sort everybody, in about 4 seconds, and I sorted them exactly backwards. I'd watched them for an hour before any of it happened, the way you watch a table you're working without seeming to watch. Roman ran that dinner like a conductor, funny, generous, ordering the best of everything, waving off the wine list and just telling me to bring what was good, tipping with the loose grandeur of a man performing his own warmth. The other couple, the business friends, laughed at everything he said and leaned toward him like plants toward a window. And Elise sat at the edge of all that light and went smaller and smaller as the night went on. She ordered the fish and moved it around her plate. When the other wife complimented her bracelet, Elise said thank you and pulled her sleeve down. Once, early on, she'd reached for her wine a second time, and Roman's hand had come across and settled over hers on the table, and from where I stood it looked tender, looked like a husband's easy affection, and she had gone very still under it, and set the glass down, and not reached for it again. I noticed all of it. I noticed it and I sorted it as a cold woman being managed by a patient, charming man, when every single piece of it was the opposite, when I was watching a decade of fear play out in miniature over one dinner, and calling it a marriage of convenience. That's how good I was at reading a room. That's how wrong reading a room can be. I want to stop right here, before I go on, and ask you something, and I mean it, because this whole story turns on it. Think of the last time you walked into a situation, and knew, just knew, who the good guy was and who the bad guy was. How sure you felt. How fast it happened. A few seconds, maybe less, before you even had words for it. We all do it, all day long, in checkout lines and comment sections and family arguments and the news. We take 3 seconds of a story, and we cast the whole play, hero and villain. And we are so rarely made to find out how wrong we were. Hold on to that feeling while you listen to the rest of this. That clean, fast certainty. Because I had it that night. That exact heroic feeling. And it nearly got a woman killed. If you've ever been wrong about someone in a way you couldn't take back, stay with me. And go ahead and subscribe, because the rest of this is the most important thing I know, and it cost me too much to keep to myself. It happened near the end of the meal. I was clearing the entree plates, leaning in close the way you do, and from that angle, that close, I saw Elise Keller's hand move over her husband's glass. It was quick, practiced even. Her hand came across with something small palmed in it, and there was the briefest pause over his wine glass, a little twist of her fingers, and then her hand was back in her lap, and she was looking down at the table, like she always looked down at the table. If I'd been standing anywhere else in that room, I'd have missed it completely. But I was right there, invisible, clearing a plate, and I saw a woman put something into her husband's wine. Everything in me went cold and certain at once. I knew what I'd seen, and the next part happened before I'd really decided to do it. I set down the plates, and I picked up the water pitcher as my excuse to lean back in. And I put my mouth close to Roman Keller's ear, close enough that only he could hear, and I whispered the 2 words that made me a hero, and that I would give years of my life to unsay. Don't drink that. He froze. His hand was already on the stem of the glass, and he went absolutely still, and then his eyes came up and found mine, and then they slid across the table to his wife, and I watched something pass over his face that I read, in the moment, as shock. As a good man understanding he'd nearly been murdered. What I know now is that it wasn't shock. It was something colder. It was a man realizing his prisoner had made a run for the fence, and calculating, already, what he was going to do about it. The rest moved fast. He didn't shout. Men like that never have to shout. He set the glass down very gently and he said, quietly, "Elise, what did you put in my wine?" And the table went silent, and Elise Keller looked up. And here is the first thing that should have told me I had it wrong. The first crack in my certainty that I was too proud of myself to feel. She didn't look like a murderer who'd been caught. She didn't bluster or deny or break down or beg. She looked at her husband with an expression I have seen since only on the faces of people who have run out of road. Pure, bottomless, exhausted despair. The look of someone who gambled everything on one last throw and watched it come up wrong, and who already knew, in that instant, exactly what it was going to cost her. I read it, in the moment, as the face of a guilty woman. It was the face of a condemned one. Roman had the glass tested. He had that kind of pull, even with a hotel. Within the hour there were people in good suits who didn't work for the police, and the wine went off in a bag, and it came back with something in it that didn't belong. Something that in enough quantity would have stopped his heart and looked. The coroner would have shrugged, like a tired rich man's bad luck. Elise didn't deny it. She didn't say anything at all, to anyone, the whole time. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes down and let it happen to her. The way I would later understand she had let a great many things happen to her. Because she had learned across 11 years that fighting only ever made it worse. And when they finally led her away, not police first, that came later, but Roman's own people, which should have been the second crack, that a private army moved before the law did, that the man could summon men in suits faster than he could summon a squad car. She passed close by me, and she stopped. Just for a second, and she looked at me, the waitress who'd done it, the one who'd leaned down and ended her one chance. and there was no hatred in her face, which is what I'd have expected, which is what I deserved. There was just that despair, and under it something almost like pity. Pity, for me, in the worst moment of her life. And she said to me, very low, 6 words I have never been able to put down. You have no idea what you've done. Then they took her, and the room exhaled, and the other couple were fluttering around Roman, and Roman was being gracious and shaken and brave, accepting the table's concern with the perfect modesty of a man who has practiced being good in public his whole life, and someone was already saying the word hero, and I stood there holding a water pitcher with those 6 words going through me like cold water down a drain. You have no idea what you've done. When they took her, her clutch fell and spilled across the floor. A lipstick, a phone, a few cards, the small ordinary contents of an ordinary woman's purse, and a small plastic thing that skittered across the marble and stopped against my shoe. A child's bracelet, the homemade kind, cheap stretchy cord strung with those little alphabet beads kids use in kindergarten, and the beads spelled out a single word, Mama. A child had made her mother a bracelet, and the mother had carried it in her purse to a dinner where she'd tried to commit murder, and now it was lying on the floor of a restaurant against my shoe, while 2 men in suits walked its owner away. I picked it up. I don't know why. I should have handed it to someone, a manager, the men in suits, anyone. Instead, I closed my hand around it and slipped it into my apron pocket. And that beaded word, Mama, is the reason I didn't get to just be the hero and go home and sleep the clean sleep of the righteous. Because a murderer is an idea, and an idea you can dismiss. A mother is a person. A mother means there is a child somewhere, a child who sat and strung beads with their small, clumsy fingers so their mama would have them close. And I stood in the wreckage of my heroic night holding that bracelet, with 6 words ringing in my ears, and for the first time the clean, certain feeling cracked all the way open, and what was waiting underneath it was not pride. It was dread. I went home and I didn't sleep, and the next morning, instead of basking, I started doing the thing I should have done before I ever opened my mouth. I started trying to understand what I'd actually seen. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, and I'm not going to pretend I did detective work. What I did was refuse to look away, which it turns out is most of it. I found out which precinct. I found out there'd be a hearing, and I went, because the bracelet was burning a hole in my apron, and I needed to give it back to whoever could get it to that child, and because I needed to look at Elise Keller one more time and understand what I'd seen in her face. The courthouse hallway is where the whole story turned over for me, because that's where I met a woman named Carol, a gray-haired, plain-spoken advocate from a domestic violence organization, who was there for Elise, and who looked at me when I said I was the waitress, and went very still, and then said, "You're the one who stopped it. Honey, do you have a minute? Because I think you should know some things, and then you can decide what kind of person you want to be about them." So I sat down on a hard courthouse bench, and Carol told me the things that nobody in that beautiful dining room had been able to see. She told it plainly, without drama, which somehow made it land harder. Roman Keller, beloved philanthropist, builder of children's wings, was a monster behind his own front door. Had been for the entire 11 years of his marriage. The kind of careful, methodical, invisible monster that the powerful get to be. Never a mark where it showed. Never a witness who'd dare. A man who controlled every dollar and every door and every friendship his wife was allowed to have. Who'd spent a decade convincing Elise that she was crazy, that she was lucky, that no one would believe her, that the police were his friends and the lawyers were his, and the judges golfed with him, which was not even a lie. He'd cut her off from her family one holiday at a time. He'd taught her, with 1,000 small corrections, to laugh on cue and pull her sleeves down and reach for the wine only once. He had made her, over 11 years, into exactly the cold, brittle, silent woman I'd despised in 4 seconds across a candlelit room. The coldness I'd judged her for was a thing he'd built. I'd looked at his handiwork and blamed her for it. She had tried to leave. Of course she had tried to leave. She'd tried the legal way, the right way, the way I'd have smugly told her to do it. She'd gone to the police once, years before, and Roman had known about it before she even got home, because the city was his, and what happened in the days after taught her never to try that particular door again. There was a prenup that left her with nothing, and a custody threat that was so much worse than nothing, because the one thing Roman had made unbearably, repeatedly clear was that if she ever ran, she would run alone, without her daughter, and he had the money and the lawyers and the spotless public reputation to make that true, and they both knew it. Her daughter, Ren, 5 years old, the maker of a beaded bracelet that was, at that moment, in my apron pocket. Elise Keller had not poisoned her husband's wine because she was cold, or greedy, or wicked. She had done it because she was a woman who had exhausted every other door, who believed, with reason, with a decade of evidence, that the law would never free her, and that leaving would cost her her child, and who had decided, in the kind of desperation most of us are lucky enough never to touch, that the only way out of that house alive and with her daughter was through a dead husband. It was a terrible thing to decide. I'm not going to stand here and tell you poisoning a man is right, because it isn't, and that's not the lesson, and Carol would be the first to say it isn't. But I sat on that bench and I finally understood that the woman I'd looked at across a candlelit table and sorted into villain in 4 smug seconds was the most trapped and frightened person in that entire room, and the warm beloved man I'd leaned down to save was the trap. And I, the hero, had sprung it shut. I had stopped her one desperate escape, and worse, so much worse, I had revealed it. Because of me, Roman Keller now knew, beyond any doubt, that his wife had tried to kill him. Do you understand what that meant for a woman living in that house, under that man, with that much to lose? I hadn't just failed to save Elise Keller, I had handed her abuser a loaded reason to destroy her, and a courtroom that was going to do it for him. Because attempted murder is attempted murder, and the wine doesn't lie. And Roman Keller was going to sit in that courtroom in a good suit, being the brave, forgiving victim, while they put the mother of his child in a cage, and he kept the child. If your stomach is in a knot, good. Mine was too. Mine still is. Before I tell you what I did about it, share this with someone who needs the reminder that you cannot read a whole life off of one moment. That the quiet one isn't always the cold one, and the warm one isn't always the good one. And subscribe, because what I learned next about how to actually help somebody, instead of how to feel heroic, is the part I most want you to walk away holding. Here is the thing I figured out on that courthouse bench. The thing that let me half undo what I'd done. I couldn't take back the whisper. I couldn't unreveal what Elise had tried, but I had something. I had the one thing Elise Keller had never been able to get in 11 years. The thing her whole trap was built on her never having, an outside witness. A credible, sober, unconnected stranger who had been standing 3 feet away, invisible, watching the real faces come out. Because once Carol told me what was true, I went back over that night in my memory, and I saw it all again with my eyes finally open, and it was everywhere. It had been everywhere the whole time, and I'd read it all backwards. The way Elise flinched, just slightly, every time Roman's hand moved, even to reach for the salt, the long sleeves in a warm room. The bruise I'd half seen at her wrist when security gripped her arm and I'd told myself meant nothing. The way she laughed exactly on cue, never early, never late. Not coldness, I understood now, but the hypervigilance of a person who has learned that getting it wrong has a cost. And Roman, when he thought no one who mattered was watching, I'd seen it and not seen it. The way his hand had closed over Elise's wrist earlier in the meal, under the table, when she'd reached for her wine too many times. A grip that looked like affection from across the room, and that I now understood, from 3 feet away, had made her go still in the particular way prey goes still. I had witnessed a decade of evidence compressed into one dinner. And because I'd already decided the story, I'd filed every piece of it under the wrong heading. That's the part that haunts me worst, if I'm honest. Not that I missed it, that I saw it. Every single sign was right there in front of my open eyes, and I'm a person who prides herself on seeing. And I looked directly at the truth and called it the opposite, because I'd already cast the play. The blindness wasn't in my eyes. It was in my certainty. I'd decided who these people were before they'd done a single thing, and then I'd bent everything I saw to fit. That's not a failure of attention. That's a failure of humility. And it's the most common one there is. And it is the reason the Roman Kellers of the world get away with it for 11 years at a stretch. Because the rest of us look at the warm, generous man and the cold, quiet woman and write exactly the story he needs us to write. So I told Carol everything I'd seen, and Carol's face changed, and she said, "Honey, you have no idea how rare you are. She has never had a single person from outside that house see what you saw. Will you say it? In front of people who can do something? Knowing he'll come after you for it?" I said yes. It's the only thing in this whole story I'm proud of. What came after was long, and it was hard, and it was not a movie. Roman Keller did come after me. His lawyers first. A letter on heavy paper suggesting I was a confused young woman who'd misremembered a traumatic event. Then the quieter pressure. The way my manager suddenly got nervous about my schedule. The way a phone call would come to the halcyon, and afterward I'd lose the good shifts. The way a man with that much weather can make your small life cold without ever once raising his voice or leaving a fingerprint. I won't pretend I wasn't scared. I was a waitress with a one-bedroom apartment going up against a man who owned pieces of the city, and there were nights I lay awake doing the math on what telling the truth might cost me and coming up short. But Carol's organization was the real thing. Lawyers who didn't golf with Roman Keller and weren't impressed by him, and had spent their whole careers prying women out of exactly this kind of trap, who knew every move he was going to make before he made it, because they'd seen 100 men make it before him, and what I'd seen became a thread they could pull, an outside witness to the dynamic, a credible stranger with no stake, describing the wrist, the flinch, the long sleeves, the grip under the table that looked like love and wasn't. It cracked the clean story open, and once it cracked, other things started coming through, the way they always do, once a powerful man's first victim is finally believed, and the spell breaks. A former personal assistant who'd quit without explanation 3 years before, and had been carrying what she'd seen ever since. A sister of Elise's who'd been frozen out of her life, and had spent years certain something was wrong, and unable to reach her. Old medical records, a wrist, a cheekbone, a set of explanations that had never quite fit, and that nobody had wanted to look at too closely, because the man writing the checks for the hospital wing was so very generous. One by one they came forward, because the first crack is always the hardest, and I happened to be the first crack. Roman Keller's careful, decade-built mask came off in public, in front of the same city that had bought me coffee and built his legend, and it came off ugly, and it did not go back on. It did not make Elise innocent of what she'd done, and the law is the law, and there was a reckoning for the wine. I want to be careful here, because I don't ever want a single person to hear this story and think the lesson is that what Elise did was right, or that I should have let a man die. Poisoning someone is not the answer, and it wasn't the answer. And Carol, who has spent 30 years helping women in Elise's exact position, would be the very first to tell you so, and to tell you that there are doors, real ones, that don't end in a courtroom or a coffin, and that the whole tragedy of Elise's story is that she'd been so thoroughly convinced none of those doors existed for her that she reached for the worst one. The lesson was never that I should have looked away from the glass. Stopping a killing is not the sin. The sin was the 4 smug seconds in which I decided I understood an entire marriage, and the ease with which I'd have collected my medal and gone home certain I was good, while a woman I'd never bothered to actually see was led off to be destroyed. But there is a vast difference between how the law treats a cold, wicked woman who poisons a good man for his money, and how it treats a battered woman who, after 11 years of documented terror, and every legal door slammed and bolted against her, finally broke. Context is not an excuse, but it is a truth, and once the truth was in the room, once there was a witness, and an assistant, and a sister, and the records, and a mask on the floor, the whole shape of the thing changed. Elise did not spend her life in a cage. The custody threat that had chained her, the one thing she'd been willing to die or kill to defeat, collapsed the very moment a judge finally understood who Roman Keller actually was. Because no court on this earth was handing that man a 5-year-old girl once the daylight got to him. And Roman himself, beloved Roman, builder of children's wings, faced his own reckoning at last. The financial kind, and the legal kind, and the slow public kind, where a whole city looks at a man it had lionized, and sees, finally, what was standing in front of it the entire time. Elise and Ren got out. That's the sentence I held on to through all the ugly months. Elise and Ren got out, and they got out alive. And they got out together, which was the only thing Elise had ever wanted, and the thing the whole trap was designed to make impossible. I gave Ren her bracelet back myself. Carol arranged it, once it was safe, months later, in a quiet sunny room that smelled like crayons at the shelter that had taken them in. A small girl with her mother's eyes, sitting on the floor with a coloring book, and I knelt down and took the little beaded mama bracelet out of my pocket, where it had ridden for half a year like a stone in my shoe, and I told her I'd found it and kept it safe for her, which was the truest thing I'd said in months. She looked at it, and she looked at me, And she said, with the total seriousness of a 5-year-old, I made that for my mom. So she'd have me with her even when I'm not there. And I had to look at the floor for a second, because that was it, wasn't it? That was the whole thing in one sentence. A little girl had strung beads so her mother would never be alone. And her mother had carried that bracelet into the worst night of her life like a talisman. And I had nearly made sure that little girl grew up without the mother she'd made it for. Ren put the bracelet on and ran off to show a worker down the hall, the way kids do. Already on to the next thing, blessedly unaware of how close the drawing of her life had come to losing a figure. Elise Keller, free, thinner, with something coming back into her face that I imagine had been gone for over a decade, watched her daughter go, and then she looked at me. The waitress who'd nearly destroyed her, the stranger who'd whispered the 2 words that should have been the end of her. And she didn't have to forgive me, and I will never fully forgive myself, but she crossed that crayon-smelling room, and she put her arms around me, and she said into my shoulder, "You came back. I kept waiting for the part where you'd disappear like everyone else, and you came back." And I understood, standing there, that the whisper was not the thing that defined me after all. Anyone can do a dramatic thing in a candlelit room and call it character. The coming back was the character. The staying when it would have been so much easier to keep my medal and go home. That was the only part of any of this I'd actually earned. We're not close, exactly, Elise and I. How could we be? I'm tangled up in the worst night of her life. But she's all right. They're all right. Ren's in school. Elise got a fair settlement once the abuse was exposed and the prenup couldn't hold. Though she'll tell you the money was never the point. The point was a door that finally opened. They live somewhere I'm not going to tell you. Somewhere quiet, where Roman Keller's weather doesn't reach. I get a card sometimes. Last one had a drawing in it. A kid's drawing, a house and a sun, and 3 stick figures that were a mom and a girl and a dog. No dad in the picture. That's the happy ending. Sometimes the happy ending is who's not in the drawing, and the whole story is just how close that drawing came to never being safe to make. Here is what I carry out of all of it, and it cost me too much to learn for me to let you walk away without it. I thought, that night, that I knew what I was looking at. I'd seen a thing with my own eyes. A wife putting poison in a husband's wine. And what could be clearer than that? What could be more obviously good than stopping a murder? And every part of that was real. And I still got the whole truth exactly backwards, because the truth of a human situation is almost never visible from across the room. We do this constantly, all of us. We walk into the middle of a story we've witnessed 3 seconds of, and we cast it instantly. There's the villain, there's the victim, there's the hero, and the hero is usually us. And we act on that casting with a confidence we have not remotely earned. The warm public man is good. The cold, quiet woman is bad. The thing that looks like rescue is rescue. And sometimes, often, more often than our certainty could survive knowing, we have it exactly upside down. And the person we're so sure we're saving is the trap. And the person we're so sure is the monster is just someone who ran out of doors. I'm not telling you to stop helping. I'm telling you the opposite. I'm telling you that helping is not the clean, heroic moment we imagine. The whisper, the dramatic save, the photo in the paper. Real helping is what comes after the moment, when it would be so easy to take your applause and go home. Real helping is staying long enough to learn the parts of the story you couldn't see from where you were standing. The bravest thing I ever did was not whispering 2 words to a billionaire. Anybody can do a brave-looking thing in a candlelit room. The bravest thing I ever did was go to that courthouse the next week, when I was already the hero, when staying could only complicate a story that was perfect for me exactly as it was, and find out I'd been wrong, and not look away from it. So, the next time you're certain, the next time you walk into the middle of something and you just know who the good guy is, I want you to hear a waitress with a beaded bracelet in her pocket, telling you to slow down. You might be right, but you might be 3 feet away from a whole life you can't see, about to do a terrible thing with a clean heart. Look again. Stay. Learn the part you're missing. It is the difference between feeling like a hero and actually being one, and they are not even close to the same thing. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been completely sure about someone, sure enough to act on it, and found out later you had them exactly backwards? What did it cost? And did you get the chance to make it right? I'll be reading. And if there's a quiet person in your life you've already quietly sorted into the wrong box, the cold one, the difficult one, the one you've decided about and stopped really looking at, maybe this week, Look again. Slower this time. Ask the question instead of assuming the answer. You may be standing 3 feet from a whole life you never once let yourself see.